All right. Hey, everyone. It's so great to be here. Seriously, this is maybe my favorite conference of the year, every single year. The community is so great. Just getting to hang out with everyone is so great. And like we've had a few post-pandemic, but this feels more lively than before. I kind of agree with what Jason was saying. It really feels like we are back in a sense. So I hope everyone has a great week. And what I want to talk to you about at Monitorama is about logging and how I think logs are actually good. So first off, my name is Alex Hidalgo. I'm the field CTO and principal reliability advocate at Noble 9. I wrote a book about SLOs once, and regardless of what my titles are, I really think of myself as a site reliability engineer, and I doubt I'll ever really think of myself as anything but that. I really care about software reliability specifically because I care so much about how the users experience things. And the other thing I really like is stories. I love stories. I think stories are important. So I want to start off this talk with a story about last year. So on Sunday, June 25th, at 8:45, my plane got to the gate at PDX. And I was here, of course, for the next day one of Montreal. And I set an alarm for 8 a.m. I woke up to get ready to come sit in this exact room to watch some talks. And, I was still on East Coast time, so I actually woke up a bit early and I kind of wandered around a bit, but, I got here for registration. And one thing I noticed before I left is I always check the weather. So, like, I have a dog, and my dog's very particular. He won't go out in the rain, for example. If it's too cold, I got to put his jacket on, right? He gets pampered a bit, but he's a moody dog, so I'm just in the habit of always checking the weather. And one thing you may have noticed, even today already, right? June in Portland's absolutely beautiful, right? It's a great time to be here. I love that the conference happens during this time because you get some great weather in the afternoons. But Portland still gets pretty chilly at night and in the early morning. So one of the things I noticed was that it was about 57 degrees out when I was leaving, when I was heading over here. And that's chilly enough for me that I wanted to make sure I was wearing some jeans and I brought a hoodie with me, right? But I also realized that later on in that day, it was supposed to be 79 degrees Fahrenheit. It's almost 80 degrees. So I just kept that in mind and we proceeded. Oh, sorry, the clicker's a little weird. So I proceeded with my jeans. That seemed like the right move for 57 degrees to start things off. And we had a whole bunch of great talks, like that morning. And we watched 4 different great talks. And then what we did was we went and had the traditional Monitorama day 1 lunch. So we're treated with some friends to Deschutes just right across the streets. And we enjoyed our lunch and we enjoyed catching up with each other. And after that, I realized, wait, I'm starting to get a little warm, right? I took my hoodie off and I didn't need all the layers I had on anymore. So I decided, I think, that I should run back to my hotel. And my intention here was just to drop off my hoodie and change from jeans into shorts. And this is the next timestamp that means something here. At 1:51, something not so great happened. You might consider it an incident. You don't have to read all these text messages, but this is actually what I sent my partner right as this happened. And the real story here is I got back to my hotel room, threw my hoodie on the bed, sat down on the bed, and I leaned over to untie my shoes. Because generally speaking, you want to untie your shoes to take off your jeans to put on your shorts, and then you'd put the shoes back on. The thing is, when I bent over to untie my shoes, I heard a snap. My back, my first true old man throw up my back incident. I instantly rolled over on the bed. Luckily, I was already sitting on it. I did not move for 4 hours. It hurt. It was bad. So the next date that might matter for this is 2 days later, the last day of Monitorama. I was supposed to be the opening talk that day, and it was a very different version of this talk. It was titled the same thing, but I was scheduled to give Logs Are Good actually at 9:30 in the morning on Wednesday, June 28th. But I was still in so much pain. So I reached out to Jason. He was like, "It's cool. We'll make you the last talk, give you some more time to recover." And I was so thankful, right? This is a good example of how great this community is. Everyone's willing to help each other. I mean, during all this time, I really barely moved. I'd made it from the Moxie to Momo's, which is 1 block away, to meet up with people for beers every night. And that was like it. I was just laying on my bed. It just hurt that bad. I almost went to the hospital, but then I was like, maybe I'll just wait till I get home, right? I don't live here. I live in New York City. And so I was rescheduled for the very last talk. And unfortunately, I was still in too much pain. So the talk just didn't happen. And luckily, it was the last talk, so it just meant the conference ended slightly earlier. It wasn't that big of a deal. I was still disappointed because I liked that version of the talk as well. But I'm able to tell you this whole story because there's a history. And I'm able to produce this history because I had these logs. I had my flight history. I knew when I landed. I was able to go look up what the temperatures actually were on June 26th here in Portland that day. So I knew it was 57 degrees when I left my hotel, and I knew it was 79 degrees later on that day. We have the Monitorama GitHub repository. This is what actually powers the website like that you look at. So we were able to go look at the change history for when I was originally scheduled to speak, who was swapped out with me, when I was moved to the end. You can even find when I was removed from the schedule entirely and the conference ended 30 minutes early. And also we have that text message retention, right? I was able to pull up the exact conversation I had with my partner to tell you exactly what minute it was that I threw my back out. So I want to continue this with another story because I love stories, right? I love things that help explain and help you think about things in a different way. And I want to talk to you about the history of logs. And this is all real. Some of this, when I first learned it, I was like, no way. Some of this etymology is too on the nose, but this is actually the real reason why we call logs, even our computer logs, why we call them logs today. So first we have Exhibit A. This is what's known as a chip log. It's a piece of wood tied to a string. And old sailing ships would throw this over the aft of the ship to help them figure out how fast they were moving. And attached to the chip log, you have a log line. I'm not kidding. This is what it's called. And this is a rope attached to the chip log that slowly unspools as the ship is moving. And you might be able to notice here, that's a knot. So the way this worked is over time, using this hourglass here, a sailor would let this line, this log line, unspool, and for each turn of the hourglass, they were able to count how many knots passed through their hands to figure out how fast the boat was moving. And yes, this is where the term knot actually comes from, right? Knots for both ships as well as aircraft, right? The measure of velocity actually literally came from sailors who used to count the number of knots on a rope that passed through their hands. But of course, you can't just have this chip log. You don't need to only know how fast you're going. You also need to know where you are in the world. So that's where they use a sextant. You need to know where you are in relation to other things. So that's where you may use a spyglass to find other ships, to find land, to kind of understand where you are, especially maps weren't great back then. You probably needed a compass to ensure that you knew which direction you were heading. But finally, I think one of the most interesting things for our discussion today live demos, right? Is Exhibit C, the ship's log. Was later called a logbook. And so this book is what they use to write everything down. They use this to write down on a regular interval. It depended on the ship, if it was once an hour, once every half an hour, but it was around the clock always, right? Where are we? How fast are we moving? What direction are we moving in? And what is near us? And this is a modern ship log. People still do this today. It's often electronic for large vessels, of course, but a lot of smaller ships still do this by hand. It's literally a book of logs. And so these regular measurements, this is what we might call metrics today, right? Something that we collect at a given interval. We probably do it more than once an hour for a lot of our computer services, right? We may scrape data once a minute from our Prometheus or collect data every 30 seconds or every 5 seconds, whatever that cadence might be. That's what constitutes a metric. A metric is something that's measured at a regular interval. But of course, we also have irregular measurements, events, things that happen, because that's entirely different than measuring something. Sometimes things occur. This could have been, a certain weather pattern like that was encountered on the ship. It could be a shortage of food, right? Whatever it was, these things also went into the logbook. It wasn't just these measurements on a regular interval. The logbook also had room to say, here's the current state of the world, or here are things that are happening to us. And all those things help tell stories. And these stories were important because it allowed the people who crewed these ships, allowed them to share with people once they got back. Here's what we saw. Here's what happened. Here's how you can better navigate the places that you want to go to next. So all this data, all these logs, and these events, and these metrics, all these things helped tell a cohesive story that people could share with each other. And humans have always been storytellers. Until written language, stories is how we used to communicate literally all the knowledge we had. Humans love stories. We love telling them to each other. We love learning lessons from them. And it's just an oral history that is baked into us as a species. People react much better to stories and narratives, in my experience, than raw numbers. And that sometimes surprises rooms full of engineers. But over the course of my career, I can absolutely tell you, every time I've needed to convince someone of something, right? Here's why we should do something different. Here's a product we should buy, a technology we should adopt, a process we should adopt. I've always been able to convince people by stories, by narratives. It's almost never been just a bunch of numbers. Now the numbers, the data, the logs, the events, they help back up that story. You need that as well. But you can't just go to someone and convince them of something by giving them a bunch of data. You've got to tell the story. And logbooks eventually, of course, got used all over the place, not just for sailing ships, but they're still used today, in a certain sense, on modern aircraft. They're used in nuclear power plants, for example, particle accelerators, all sorts of things where it's very important for you to keep track of exactly what's happening and when, as well as what your measurements are, what your metrics are, and when, all goes into things that are still called logbooks. And of course, our computers. We have logs running everywhere on the operating system, hardware level logs, our software produces logs, or it's everywhere. It's a lot of data. But I feel like logs have gotten a bad rep in recent years. And some of this is, I don't want to say deserved, but I think it's a side effect of the fact that we are currently at a time where the monitoring and observability movements within our industry have been moving at a breakneck pace with no sign of slowing down. I currently work for a vendor that talks to other monitoring and observability and telemetry tools. There are hundreds of companies out there trying to sell you this stuff. It is absolutely mind-boggling. I had no idea, right? There's the big players that we've all probably heard of, but there are so many movers in the space. And I think the reason why is because we're seeing real breakthroughs in how things are done. But logs are still viewed as kind of old-fashioned. And I feel like too often they kind of take a back seat. But I think logs are still actually very important. So here at Monitorama, this week, 40%, 41.666% of every single talk at the entire conference is about distributed tracing. Disclaimer, I love distributed tracing. I think it's great. Everyone should be doing it if possible. But I don't think it's the end-all be-all, right? Should be another arrow in your quiver. It should not be the only way that you approach everything, especially because distributed tracing is really, really, really good at certain things, but it's really bad at other things as well. And that's why I wish we still paid more attention to logs. They can be just as important if used correctly. Logs are still important to your systems today, and I hope that you can find ways to improve not just your observability posture by introducing advanced distributed tracing and open telemetry, wonderful things again, right? I'm not here to slam them. I'm here to hopefully help remind people that there's other bits of telemetry that can tell you different stories than your metrics, your time series, or your traces can. And this is, everything is a distributed app. And it's definitely the case that not everything is a high QPS distributed app. For example, still many people probably in this very room who have to care about either hardware or VMs, right? You are likely going to get a lot out of these system level logs that tell you how things are operating at the operating system level, for example, than you might get out of other tools. Operating systems themselves, of course, networking gear, right? Often forgotten in the cloud world, but someone's still running that networking for you. And it's probably some of you in this room, right? It still exists, even if you don't have to think about it as much as we all used to 10, 15, 20 years ago. Or open source software. Right? I see a lot of people like, oh, do this newest best thing. But what if your team is responsible for, I don't know, a MySQL database installed somewhere? You can't just slap distributed tracing on that, right? There's ways to do it by building shim layers, and we can get into all that over beers later tonight, right? But the point is, there's a lot of teams who might feel left out from the fancy fun things, the things that 40% of the talks at this conference are about, when all they have really are these logs. These logs are still important because they can still help them do their job. Or business applications, maybe it's not even open source, right? But a lot of people are probably responsible for keeping IT-ish business style applications up and running, where you have no access to the source code. You can't change what the telemetry is from those apps. So make sure that you're using those logs. And of course, there's lots of other logs in our industry as well. There's compliance logs, and security logs, and audit logs, right? These are all incredibly important for us to do our jobs correctly. It's not just about keeping distributed high QPS web apps up. We also got to make sure that we are secure for our customers, that we're meeting compliance for our customers, that we're able to audit things when our customers require us to audit them. And these are all places where we need to make sure that we're not just logging, but we're logging well, that we understand how to go retrieve that data and how to use that data. And there's this other little secret. Tracing spans are just fancy logs. They're structured log lines with a parent ID so that you can connect them. The biggest difference really between a well set up logging system and a good distributed tracing system, the biggest difference is the backend database and what you query, right? A logging database is all about indexing and being able to find historical records. A tracing database is all about assembling a bunch of separate log lines, these spans, and having them mean something to you. And they serve very different purposes. And I'll get to that in 1 second, but there's I think maybe the most important thing about logs is that they're messages from the past, right? Logs are intentional. Someone purposely put that there. Someone had to write a line of code at some point to say, I think it's important that someone else in the future is able to discover this thing. So what we spend so much time talking about helps you solve unknown unknowns, which is super important, especially in the moment, especially when you're troubleshooting perhaps an incident or a regression, whatever it might be. Unknown unknowns are very difficult to find, and some of the more advanced distributed tracing and open telemetry solutions and all that really help you find that. But logs are a great place to find known unknowns. Again, they're intentional. Someone had to choose to say, I know this thing's going to happen. I don't know why necessarily, but I know that there's a chance that this error could occur. So let me make sure I catch it and let me make sure I log it. But even more important, I think a thing that we often forget about when we're talking about how important it is to be able to identify unknown unknowns by having the right telemetry available to us, but there's also those known knowns. There's things that people know are going to break in a certain way at a certain time. And those things are just as important if we're going to keep our systems reliable and if we're going to make sure that we have the best overall view of how they're actually operating. And again, this is because logs are intentional, right? So tracing helps you discover things, which is super powerful. But also, don't forget to listen to the people who came before, the people who actually wrote the code. because they help you tell stories. They help you understand what the past might have been like, which can help you figure out what the future might look like. So if you ever feel lost at sea and you're not sure exactly where you are or where you're going or how fast you're moving, remember that someone was probably there already, and hopefully they've left you some kind of message. So listen to those messages because they can tell you a lot. Thanks. And we should have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any, or if not, you can just come find me at any point in time this week. I'm here till Friday.
You're here all week?
I am.
Yeah, we've got some time for questions as I come rushing out on the stage. Thanks for finishing early. Yeah, we have time for questions. Let's just see, are there any out here? I'm gonna look around. And if
My talk was flawless.
And I cannot, oh, we got one up top. How is your back doing this year?
Just fine. But I will say I checked into the same hotel, and as far as I can tell, it might be the same room, or at least it looks exactly the same. And there was a slight moment of like flashback, like, do I even lay down on this bed? But no, like things are fine this year. Thank you for asking. Yeah.
What brand of slide pointer is that?
What brand of slide pointer? Oh, this is actually not even his.
No, it's not even mine.
Use the laser pointer? There's a laser pointer on it.
Well, that part works. The back and forth just stopped working.
Oh, I don't know. Jason bought it, so we can blame him.
It's a Logitech. It's that standard Logitech with a little USB-A slidey thing that like everyone owns, but yeah, I don't know. See, now it's, no, back works. Forward does not, I don't know anymore. Anyway.
Question down here?
So you mentioned that logs tell a story, which is absolutely right. Do you think by nature they lend themselves well into the world of AI/ML and Gaussian analysis? Do you think that
Ooh.
all the telemetry components logs are best or anything like that?
I think if we're talking about logs in, oh yeah, sorry. Logs tell a story, and how might that feed into our contemporary discussions about AI and LLMs and ML, et cetera. I think if we talk about logs in the abstract, in the terms that they are markers of events over a long period of time, right? Like a thing a log gives you is you can often go back a year or 2 years and go find that data, like the text messages I sent or the weather, right? Whereas some more contemporary things, even time series, often get downsampled pretty quickly. Traces definitely aren't persisted 100% over years. So I think in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is that you need long retention periods of data to train models properly. All right. So even if we're not necessarily talking about it exactly using your system logs or your application logs to train a model, I do think the concept of having a long running set, like a data, is very important to make sure that we're building the right models. Yeah.
Do you have any advice on getting teams to stop logging at debug?
What was the question? How do you get teams to stop logging debug?
So the stories are relevant instead of just getting noise.
Right. I think, so a thing I've actually done in the past, so I used to run the team that was responsible for all the telemetry systems at Squarespace, and we had a massive elk stack. And every request for a website, like you go visit a Squarespace website, right? A single page load would send something like, I think it was 127 different log lines for each visit. And so we were actually the busiest service at Squarespace because that was hundreds of thousands of log lines per second, right? And one of the things we discovered was, in fact, too many people were logging everything to debug, for example, right? Whereas you really only need that if you really think you have a problem. So what I did is we actually set up a workshop that we went team by team. And what I did was I joined all these other teams' team meetings, on like cadence, like, hey, we have this guest speaker. And I'm like, hey, there are defined POSIX compliant definitions for what info means versus what warn means versus what debug means. And what I found was a lot of people, I think perhaps because they are younger and have grown up using different telemetry systems didn't even know what the difference between all those things were, right? And just a simple session of being like, hey, here are the definitions. They've been around for 4 decades at this point, right? Just use these was actually a very helpful way of getting that across a little bit. I think I gotta go.
We got. We still have. Yeah.
Yeah.
If there is another question, I hate to cut out if there's
No, I
good
see.
questions here. If
I'll-
they're not good questions, then don't.
Yes. Who has
Only
the
good
best
questions.
question?
There was one right here.
One more good question.
I was wondering what in your mind was the difference between a good log and a bad log.
So I think a good log is one that actually tells you something, right? Something that can contribute to that story, over time. Something that if you're just talking about trying to expose metrics to be collected, right? Like, let's talk about an actual like API, right? Like latency measurements is not a good log. That's what time series metrics are for, right? But I had to restart is a very good log, right? Even if it didn't interrupt the actual service from your customer perspective or whatever, that helps you tell a story over time, right? Why did it restart? Now you can go dig into that, Anyway, we don't have tons of time. That's a great question. I'll be happy to chat more about over beers. One more. We had a few more. Okay, all the way in the back.
Wondering about unstructured versus unstructured logs. Like, a lot of these systems, like OSL, unstructured logs.
Yes.
Unstructured, right?
Okay, so the question is like structured versus unstructured logs. I mean, structured logs are just simply a superior evolution of unstructured logs, right? Even unstructured logs, you can get really fancy with your grep and your sed and turn them into something structured, right? And that's what we used to actually do, But yes, please give your logs meaning, right? Give them fields, give them definitions, because if these are going to be events that help you tell a story, if these are going to be events that help you understand, everyone needs to be on the same page. And you do that by having fields, by having a structure, by having a schema.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks again, everyone.
Big round of applause. Alex, thank you.